Hello and welcome to episode 1B of Mjolnir, the miniseries. That's right, we're still looking at the miniseries GBH by Alan Bleasdale. I'm David Yorkshire, and with me as ever are Neil and James. Hello to you two.
Hello.
Hello.
So, as I say, this is episode 1B, in other words, the second part of this particular look at a miniseries. So, if you haven't seen 1A, I suggest you do so now. Now, we're in this particular episode, we're looking at episodes 2 and 3 of GBH. So, who would like to start off with a bit of a recap and the second episode, just give an overview of the plot?
Well, I think the second episode, it really ups the ante. It's, I would say, maybe the most shocking episode. Would that be fair to say, out of all of them?
Well, you've got the part with the boy. That's certainly
Yeah,
a shock
yeah,
to
that's like
sit
a
on
real
there.
heart-wrencher, that.
And Michael Palin's amazing, possibly only debut as a stuntman as he rolled down that hill. That was not acted. You could tell that was not acted, but what a credit that he just acted straight through it despite tumbling head over heels.
I know, you could tell he really wanted to swear. Just by looking at his face, you could tell he hurt himself.
That's right. So, sort of recapping from the first episode, we've had this strike, which the teacher, headmaster, actually, Jim Nelson, has broken. Although there were no pickets, so it didn't go through a picket line at school. The strike was basically to cause havoc in the city, this unnamed city, although really it's Liverpool. Although it's filmed in Manchester, actually. But anyway. But all Bleasdale's little miniseries and so on tend to be filmed around Liverpool, which is why you have a lot of actors from the Liverpool theatre community. But anyway, this strike has been caused to create havoc in the city to try to bring down the Conservative government at the time. Now, we have, first of all, this nightmare, which was obviously caused by the confrontations between Jim Nelson and the pickets, or mob as they are, and between Jim Nelson and Michael Murray. And he's obviously losing his mind a bit because he wakes up in a wardrobe, doesn't he?
Yeah.
Yeah, and you get the feeling it's anxiety outlet from he's had before because of the wife's comments.
That's right. One of the interesting things I thought was Bleasdale tries to get a few things in, little bits of ideology and so on. So Jim Nelson, who's the hero, of course, he says, God would help me if he existed. He's always pushing these little things, the leftist atheism.
That's more than once you hear the comments about atheism and how reincarnation would have a committee if it existed and so on. He does get that in several times.
That's right, yeah. And then he goes out for a walk with the dog, and that's where well, first of all, he comes across these poachers, doesn't he?
That's right.
That's right.
It was actually, it's despite the fact it was very seriously played, it ends up sort of darkly funny because you've got the poachers who are there with hammers to kill sheep and steal it, and see him thinking he's a farmer, and then talk about, well, it's the law of the land, and that's where they're just going to kick his head off if the farmer argues, because they think Jim Nelson's the farmer from the way he's dressed. And then they get a moral outrage because they recognise him as the scab. So they're the possibly murdering thieves are now morally outraged at somebody being a scab, and they start shouting out the windows, "Scab, scab!"
That's
They
right.
deface the car as well, don't they?
That's is it the same people?
No, it's
who
a different
defaced the
mob.
car? Yeah, that's
Was a different
obviously-
one. Yeah.
That mob's the one that had the sneaky agent guiding them, remember?
Oh,
I
yeah.
forget
that's
his
the one,
name.
that's the one.
That's a different mob. Those ones were just local thieves.
Oh, so they weren't connected anyway. I assumed they were connected in some way.
No, that's why they were so incompetent. They were just out for stealing
Right,
stealing sheep, because we're talking about they wanted to put food on the table at Christmas, some meat on the table.
It's interesting, actually, because I don't think we ever see these people again, do we?
Not that I'm aware of. I think they were just set up as a passing by to give you an idea of the sort of tone of the locals, albeit the worst of them.
Yeah, I think they're there as comic relief as well. As you've said, there's that element of humour, the irony.
Also showing the
that
poverty.
they sort of, yeah, that's true. It's interesting because, I mean, Jim Nelson actually makes excuses for them, doesn't he? And then he says that I've been reading too much of The Guardian.
Yeah, that's
So-
right. Which does show, does Bleasdale have that wee bit of self-awareness that maybe these things are going too far, too many excuses, maybe giving him too much credit, I don't know.
It's a funny thing with Bleasdale, actually, and I never quite know how far left he is. He does sometimes attack his own side.
That parcel of rogues in the car, you're talking about people who are hypocrites, probably murderers, and sheep-stealing thieves. And also, if you're an animal rights type, they were going to sledgehammer sheep and beat them with hammers to kill them. So there's very little sympathy for these people.
Yeah.
They're really showing his
right.
vile in the performance.
I actually thought, because it was very strange, because you see the boy who dies in just a few moments, but you see him with an axe, and I sort of thought, well, is he going to poach sheep as well? Because he's armed like the poachers and everything. But of course, you find out later that he's collecting sticks for his grandmother.
And because he's a kind of simple boy, he's not really realised what he's doing.
They do open it up with the boy like dragging the axe. I think they make emphasis on the
They build it up.
The blade actually dragging through the ground, and it's almost like a serial killer type of moment. And you see the kid with you think, what's that kid doing with an axe? And it kind of throws you off. It's very interesting. Before that, there's a comedic moment that goes a little bit sour. Then you have this scene where you see the kid with the axe, and you think that's a too strange combination of scenes. Then a few seconds later, the power line explodes and hits the boy in the foot. And it's like, then it goes to a very horrific moment.
I suppose that's quite clever writing, and that the switch from comedy to tragedy like that does hit you harder, because it's a sudden flip, and you're softened up, and then it hits you. Also, that accident, was that not the most bizarre freak accident ever? You just happen to be looking at a power line when the cable suddenly spontaneously sparks and comes off and hits you in the leg. What are the odds?
Yeah.
You're just walking through. You're just walking through a field and you get hit by a cable. I mean, I'm not saying things like that don't happen in life, but as a writer, it's an odd thing to choose for the accident.
Yes, it's almost like you willed it down on yourself, isn't it?
Yeah, like an act of God or something.
That's right. The God that supposedly doesn't exist. But this is the odd thing about atheists, isn't it? That often they say that they don't believe in a God, but yet rail against this God they don't believe in all the time.
When I was watching that the first time, I was aware that there was going to be an accident. So I kind of thought, oh, the boy's obviously going to use the axe and hurt himself. And then I saw the power line. I thought, oh, he's probably going to do something stupid like hit one of the, something.
That's what I thought,
Yeah, use the axe somehow to connect himself to the power or do something like that. But no, it just randomly detaches for no apparent reason. There's a spark. The cable detaches live and hits him in the leg. The foot. It could have been.
I think it was a deliberate
2 inches to the left or right, and it would have missed him. In this huge field with no trees in it.
Though, because I felt that way as well. I thought that boy's going to chop down that
Yeah.
power line pole and hurt himself, but no, it's going to fall anyway and hit him. And it's like a cheap trick to make you think, I bet you thought that little boy was going to do that.
Although, the trouble with that is, that only works because if you watch it aware of what's going to happen. The first viewing, he just walks along and he looks up at the pole, and then it happens. It's so quick, you don't have the time to think of him acting with the axe and doing anything, because he's just looking up in curiosity at some sparks, and then bang, the boy's done for. Very, very strange. There's no explanation. Even the fact that he's in this big open field with no trees worth chopping down, so I don't know where he was getting the firewood even. But he's in an open field for grazing land. Where's he getting the trees? I don't know, but he just happens to be walking just in the right spot for that cable.
Yeah.
No path. It's not even like he's following a path.
Yeah, I think this is a bit of bad writing on Bleasdale's part, actually, isn't it?
And you even see the spot where he died, because they lay some flowers where he died, and you see that it's even an odd bit of the slope. I mean, if you do much country walks or rough ground, there's obvious bits you walk on, and you'll see animal tracks follow the same paths that a human would take. He was even walking kind of halfway on the slope, according to where the flowers were. and this way the scene's done. I thought, that's a kind of... Everything about it's weird.
I think it's like honestly, just a cheap writing trick.
It is.
An injured dead kid in there and have the hero try to save his life. So
Yeah.
he now goes from being a normal man into a normal man who once tried to save a dying kid, and he will forever be the good guy for the rest of the TV show. It's
right.
just cheap.
I think you're both right. It's bad writing. I don't know why he had an act of God, but it's bad writing.
It also sets up as well why these people from the farmlands, why they support Jim Nelson after that. And it is, again, a bit of bad writing. It's an excuse, but it's not a very well thought out one.
They could have easily had the loyalty from the farmers earned from him just looking after their boy, without the boy being dead at all.
Yeah, or at least have a convincing death.
Yeah, they could have had the boy injure himself with the axe. It wouldn't have been any less gruesome, because they actually show the foot spurting blood, all burnt. It's pretty gruesome.
Yeah,
so
it's pretty horrific.
So they could have easily had the boy chop himself and bleed to death.
Yeah, I think what it was, he didn't want it to be so obvious, and so went for something completely left of field. We're talking about the left here, but something that comes in from left field, and it's so manufactured, it's so artificial. Just because he wants it to be a surprise.
He could have had the Acme 10-ton weight just drop out the sky on him, really. Roadrunner style.
With a big whistle before.
small umbrella put up.
That's right. Go on, attack me with that fresh fruit. Suddenly the big weight drops on his head. Something like that. Yeah, Bleasdale is a good writer, but at some points you just think, well, what was he thinking there? And that's bad writing. And it is here. Sometimes he does write quite badly. I suppose nobody's infallible.
And of course, if you've got a good standard for the rest of it, when you really screw up, it stands out all the more.
That's very true, yeah.
It doesn't ruin the episode, though. I mean, it is cheap and the writing was bad, but it doesn't make the episode bad. It doesn't put in a downer for the rest of the episode.
Well, what helps is it moves so quick at that point, you don't really have time to think about it until after you're sort of looking back on it.
Yeah.
And I think that one of the reasons for all this as well, because you've got Jim Nelson's family, you've got the death of his child, and then this comes into the next scene where you have Michael Murray and his mother and his brother in the mayoral car. They go to visit Michael Murray's father's grave, and of course his brother Frank's father's grave, and his mother's husband, obviously. And it contrasts in a way. So you have a similar theme, the theme of death, but you have very different reactions to it, and a very different story to it. I don't know if you thought about that. There's a lot of themes of death actually in the first 20 minutes or so.
Yeah, I would say for the whole episode, even towards the end when he's asking his mother what his father was like, she can't remember, being dead such a long time, and she can't remember all these. Well, she claims she can't remember.
Yeah.
And the way he remembers his dead father, everything's affected by death in some way.
Don't know if any's noticed when he asks for the photograph from the wall, and it's shown as a kind of empty space, and it's made a bit of a thing. You know, they make a bit of a thing in the scene with this empty space and the mother looking at it as if he's sort of imposing by taking that. When it pans to the mother, right behind us another copy of the same photo sitting in the opposite wall.
Is there?
Yeah.
Oh,
You can actually see the prop department completely fluffed it. They obviously are looking for extra old looking photos to sort of pad out the room design, and they foolishly obviously made a second copy of a photo without realising that this was going to be used in a close-up as an iconic repeat close-up in this plot. And you can see that because of the distinct band of white squares down one side. It drew my eye straight away, and I said, that's another copy there. Why is she worried about the photo missing? Or why is Michael taking that copy when there's another copy sitting framed in the mantelpiece? He could have just picked that one up rather than the one in the wall.
That is some eagle eyes you've got.
Yeah, that's well observed. Bloody hell. But yeah, but that's actually, I mean, apart from the props department, which was nothing to do with Bleasdale, really. But
he was there on set, though. He's got to get some blame. If we're giving him credit, he gets blame.
Yeah, that's true.
Okay. But it's also good writing in the whole episode comes round full circle. Because in many ways, if you look at both the series as a whole and each episode, they sort of come round and come back to the beginning almost. So you have this idea of linear and cyclic time. And that's good writing, actually. So, I'll give Bleasdale his props, even though he's a leftist scum.
I hope he's not listening to this.
Who knows? Well, if he is, he might
Hello.
learn.
Hello. We did like it. We did like your series, so leave a comment and subscribe. There's much more Bleasdale if you want to listen.
You may like our stuff on Birth of a Nation. But yeah, it's interesting, the difference, because you always have the parallels and differences between the two major characters, Michael Murray and Jim Nelson, and their attitudes to death here. Of course, there's nothing, in a way, Jim Nelson is empowered because he tries to save the child, although he fails ultimately. But of course, Michael Murray is powerless because the events already happened. It happened even before he was born, something that he berates throughout this episode.
And there's also the scene with him later on, isn't there, where shall we ruin it for everybody?
Oh, well, anybody listening to this should have watched it.
Yeah, well, you should have watched it by now. Yeah. But there's obviously the scene where there's a scene where him as a child, he has undergone something pretty traumatic when his teacher lays into him.
Yeah, the hamster.
Yeah.
And you get the impression that it was probably an accident because he spilt that sulfuric acid on them.
And it was probably the last time in his life where he actually told the truth.
Yeah.
Which I thought was really interesting because, what happened after that, he became this ruthless, cold liar, basically.
It shows you how his flaws then cause new flaws in the next generation as well, because the headmaster is seen repeatedly in different ways as this highly strung, sort of weak man that is full of regrets and problems of his own.
Yeah.
Highlighted worst of all with Michael's mum.
That's right.
If you notice, and we didn't really mention this in the first episode, but the first episode actually starts with the headmaster himself, Mr. Weller, because he's really the building block of all this. He's the start of all this. Just as he's the start of the series. And what happened with Michael Murray. Because, of course, Michael Murray's been set up all the time by this Eileen Critchley girl, this girl who's obsessed with Ruth Ellis. We see this in the first episode. Did you notice, by the way, when Michael Murray was writing, he got 9 o'clock, because he was thinking back to that day at 9 o'clock when Ruth Ellis was hanged. And, of course, you get these flashbacks to when he was a child, his relationship with this old girl called Eileen Critchley, who was obsessed with being killed and, and being hanged and everything. But at the same time, being cruel to Michael Murray, because she's sort of got this fixation with Ruth Ellis, who was the last woman to be hanged in Britain, for the American people who don't know. Ruth Ellis is interesting because I saw a documentary about Albert Pierpoint, who was the hangman at the time, who hanged Ruth Ellis. And he said that she showed no remorse whatsoever. She showed no emotion when she was hanged because she killed her husband, as I remember rightly. And she was obviously not a nice woman at all, but the feminist lobby came out and supported her just because she was a woman being hanged. But anyway, that's by the by. Well, it's not by the by, really, actually, because it has to do with the character of this Eileen Critchley girl, because she's obviously a nasty and ruthless little girl who is psychologically unstable.
Yeah.
And, of course, Michael Murray gets the blame for these hamsters. We find out later in the series, spoilers here, that it was Eileen Critchley who poured acid over the hamsters, and he got the blame for it. But equally, you realize that when Mr. Weller canes Michael Murray and really lays into him, that it's also because of his frustration, because he's attracted to Michael Murray's mother, who's of course a widow, but can't get the courage to ask her out.
Do you think the TV show hinted at anything further? Because it kind of cuts out after a few whips with the stick that he has. Does it suggest that more happened? because the tone of the voice after that scene is where he's trying to convince him, now we're going to tell nobody about this, that this is our little secret. And it sounds very sinister. And it kind of makes like the hairs on your arm stand on end. But there's this very sinister tone that you would probably expect from a child molester. It's our little secret. Don't tell anybody. There's a very sinister tone to it.
Yeah, I get you there. I don't think that there was anything sexual. I didn't get that really, but I certainly think that he'd absolutely laid into him and completely lost all reason and everything. He went above and beyond simply because of his own frustrations.
He obviously takes pride in being civilized and his self-control, so for him it was a great shame.
It kind of destroyed them both, didn't it, at the same time?
Yeah.
Both their lives fell apart after that.
You can see how it haunts the headmaster character, Weller, in later episodes. It keeps coming back to haunt him too.
It does, yeah. Because actually the whole series, going back to the very beginning of the series again, he's reading The Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock by T.S. Eliot, which he comes back to throughout the series, which is how in the next episode, I think it's in the third episode, isn't it, which we'll be looking at in a little bit. But in the third episode, he actually tries to ask Michael Murray's mother out through poetry, through the poetry of T.S. Eliot. And of course, she's completely ignorant. You know, she's not very bright at all. And she doesn't get it at all. She doesn't get the reference. She doesn't get what he's trying to say. And it's a comedic moment where he's saying, "I'm J. Alfred Prufrock," and she says, "Well, why did you change your name?" Well, it is a bit of a silly name, isn't it?
I think we've all been in a similar situation like that. We're trying to read poetry to our lassie, and it's never worked out as well as what we thought it was going to.
I think
very few women appreciate poetry.
Yeah.
I think Mr. Weller could have done better if he'd done the old classic where they'd hand you the card. Do you like me? Tick yes, tick no. That would have probably gone down better than his attempt with this poetry, or him mouthing "I love you" behind her back over and over again. Bizarre.
Yeah.
Tolkien had it far better, didn't he? You know, he found a woman who appreciated poetry. But anyway,
I think poor Mr. Well, if he just had a bit more courage, it would have all been sorted in about 5 minutes, one way or the other.
That's right.
It was a good way of showing his character. He had all these flaws, obviously, the highly strung, he had his temper, burdened with shame, and also a lot of self-confidence issues if he can't even sort of speak to her.
Well, it's interesting as well that it's T.S. Eliot that's chosen, because if you remember, Jim Nelson says that he's a teacher of the old type. In other words, he's a conservative, and T.S. Eliot is a conservative writer.
Okay.
And he's mocking conservatives there to a degree. He's mocking people like T.S. Eliot, actually. Although T.S. Eliot, in a way, was mocking himself with the Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock, because it's this man who's in middle age, and of course he's tried to hang around women and so on, but never had the courage to ask them out.
I think it was a stab at conservatives then. This is what they're like. They're teachers who beat children, who are weak men who can't ask women out or can't have relationships with them.
It's probably a lot easier for Bleasdale to put all these character flaws in a conservative character rather than one of the more left-wing.
And what's the worst person in the world? That there's someone who would beat up a kid. And you can't get more awful than that. So
it was also the way Weller completely crumbled, because as it went on, he seemed almost mentally simple. The way he started acting, like when he turns up at the school, he's
hiding in the toilets.
Hiding in the toilets. He babbles to Jim Nelson. When he's in his house, he's babbling and confused. It's like he's had I suppose it is some sort of mental breakdown. But you know that he couldn't have been a respected headmaster behaving like that.
Yeah, that's very right.
And remember the local education board, I'm not sure, was some sort of high-level civil servant. He had the highest respect for him.
Yeah, there's obviously been a degeneration there, but equally the anti-corporal punishment movement was a very left-wing movement in schools. I mean, even going back to James Joyce, you have this unjust corporal punishment scene in The Portrait of an Artist as a Young Man. So it goes back quite a long time. This is why you realize that this guy is a conservative and is having a piss taken out of him, basically. So,
do you think in an odd sort of way, writing him that way was a sort of revenge?
Yeah, very much so. Certainly it was with James Joyce, because James Joyce never got over the fact that he was beaten as a child. Now, I was at school, but that's life. I got beaten over the head by my biology teacher with his umbrella. But, you know, when you call your teacher a bald bastard, what do you expect, you know?
Well, was he bald?
He was, yeah.
And was he a bastard?
Oh,
no, actually, it was a decent guy. It was perfectly my fault. So, but it was all in good humour. Yeah, that's the thing.
We think it's kind of ironic that by writing that teacher in the way he did to get revenge at these past teachers, he's acting just like the Michael Murray character, but in his writer's position. He's getting petty revenge against these teachers of the past.
Yeah, he must
right.
be, yeah.
Yeah, because, of course, the rightist idea. This is the thing about the left. They never grow up. They still remain infantile and still remain like rebellious teens and still have these petty revenges and so on. They never have a sense of magnanimity. It's and this is the problem with Bleasdale. You always have a sense of that he's getting back at someone. And that's...
it's so petty.
Yeah, there is a certain pettiness every now and again, but overall, you know, as I say, I think that he's a good writer, but every so often you do get elements where you think, you know, he's being a bit petty there, or that's a bit constructed, that's a bit artificial, and so on. And I think that in this case, the headmaster figure, he is a caricatured figure. He really is. I mean, how many headmasters do you know like that?
My one wasn't like that. I was scared of my one. And we didn't even have the belt or anything back then. We just had guys who would tell it straight to you. But I can't see him taking control of rowdy kids. Yeah, I can't see him taking control of or authorizing teachers what to do and just gaining respect, acting like that.
Even just acting as as you say, a manager of staff, which you'd have to do. One of the teachers would just dominate him, you know, socially and at work.
It's almost like Bleasdale's saying, listen, this guy Michael, although he's a bad character and he's devious and he's a liar, there's a reason for it. And it's bad teachers, it's a bad upbringing. There's always a reason why, because he is a leftist in the movie, Michael's character. But at the same time, he's kind of corrupt. He's always under the thumb of someone. And you find out in the third episode just how he's not really at the top. He thinks he is, but there's someone above him just hitting him up, just to keep him down enough so he doesn't feel like he can rise up and take fully control. It's a very interesting character, how he's developed, even in the first 3 episodes, just what made him that way.
And there's his wee bit of self-awareness with the writer, possibly, when he has the sheep rustlers and that comment we mentioned earlier on about the reading too much of The Guardian. You know, he's given excuses for Michael Murray, who's really quite a monster, really, as you watch what he does.
But always like little reasons for it. It's not really his fault. It's someone else. It's this person. It's the girl. It's the teacher. It's whoever. It's his dad not being there. It's his mum being a little bit more friendly towards the brother whose name I forget. More attention to them. It's like there's always a reason why he became this.
If you look at the blame, where blame lies ultimately, it is always with rightist characters. So it's with the headmaster, it's with Judge Critchley, it's with the sort of MI5 Tory guys who we'll get onto in the next episode. It's with those people. It's with the right all the time.
Yeah.
The left, they always get consideration. They always have an excuse. There's always this idea that, okay, they can be blamed, but there's mitigating circumstances.
Yeah.
But with the right, there never is. That's always an important thing to remember with Bleasdale.
Yeah.
Because in real life, when you got some sort of monster on the rampage, like Michael Murray or some other type, it doesn't really matter what the reasons behind it. The only thing that matters is the fact he, right now, is leaving a wake of misery and destruction.
Yeah.
It doesn't really matter if he had an unhappy childhood or not. And nobody, if that was a real life situation, would give two hoots about it if they're suffering.
That's right. Because
it's a weird obsession about the past and excuses, and none of it matters. Really, what he's doing right then and there, it doesn't really matter. Not from a writing and a story point of view, but from a real life point of view. If this was a real life situation, you're not going to say, "Oh, well, it's okay. He's ruining the education board and putting in a drunk binman, to lead education in that area because somebody spanked him as a kid or something." It doesn't matter.
But to the left, that always matters because, of course, they have this idea of the blank slate. So therefore, evil has to come through things that happened to them as a child, which is basic psychology and psychoanalysis and so on. So they have to have an explanation for evil and for wickedness because they don't believe in things that are innate.
Okay, so you end up in this situation where nobody can actually be to blame for anything because then you can easily say, well, the head teacher behaves the way he does because of... and on it goes back to the dawn of time.
But the thing is, they don't really touch on that at all, do they? Jim Nelson's childhood, which is interesting because he's the other main character. There's two main characters, him and Michael, and you don't really hear anything about Jim Nelson's
But that's because he
childhood.
doesn't need an excuse to be as he is. He's the good
That's
guy.
right, yeah.
Slightly unbalanced, it makes the show, though, because we don't know how he became so good. We just know how Michael became so bad, but we don't know what events happened in Jim's life to make him so good and righteous and nice to everybody.
When you listen to the interview Bleasdale did in particular, you get the impression that Bleasdale believes that everybody's good and it's just something happens to make people bad.
This comes from liberal philosophy. This comes from the likes of John Locke, and even although Rousseau sometimes gets lumped in with the conservatives, but he isn't really. Even Rousseau, this idea that man is born innately good, and then it comes from a Christian view of life ultimately, but of course they've taken away the religion. So they have how can you be a blank slate and yet be born good? There are always these contradictions with the left. And as I say, it's the same with the fact that the right always gets the blame, but what is it about the right then? Why are these people so bad? Why is Weller like that? Why is he a bit of a coward? Why is he not courageous in asking out women? What is it about that? This is never explored, of course, because it's this idea that just like Christianity, you have a good and an evil, but you never explore what real evil is. There are certain things like Satan, for example, in Christianity. Satan is just evil. He makes wrong decisions and he falls from grace. And that's the leftist idea of the right.
Yes, you're either at one or the other.
Yeah. Whereas if you're sort of on the left, then you make mistakes.
Yeah. And bad things happen to you, and it's not your fault.
Yeah, exactly.
So if you're on the left and you do something wrong, it's a mistake. If you're on the right and you do something they think's wrong, then it's because you're bad.
or the devil did it.
Well, we can see that now. We can absolutely see that in society, where anybody with right-wing ideas are demonized.
Very much so now with the social media and the mainstream media going absolutely bonkers in the past couple of years. Very visceral, emotional reactions now to any kind of contradictory thought or politics. Less and less ability to debate and discuss at all.
That's right. Whereas I see things the other way. I don't see the left as particularly evil, if you like, because I don't really believe in an absolute good and absolute evil, being a pagan. But certainly they do bad things because they have an ideology that's completely fucking retarded. That's, and they're working to this ideology that they have as a sort of replacement for the Bible, really.
And if you've got a bad or bonkers foundation for your theology, or you're trying to fit everything into this box that's misshapen, it's only going to keep getting worse the more you try and adjust everything, the more you try and fit in it.
That's right. Now, don't get me wrong, the Bible is equally retarded, but you don't go even more down that road, because the Bible preaches equality and stuff like that, and they say what we need is even more equality. And so they've gone, to the left of even the Bible, which I believe is a completely leftist religion in general. And Jonathan Bowden would have agreed with me. In fact, he did agree with me. But anyway,
That'll start some good controversy in the comments. Go on, folks, argue about it.
Yeah.
Have a go at me. See if you can actually win this debate.
Convert them, people. Convert them. Have a go.
You better know your scriptures. I'll tell you that. But yeah, politics plays a huge, and it's really overdone in my opinion. He really overplays politics in this miniseries, because the funeral wake itself of that young lad, getting back to the denouement of this particular episode, is held at the Labour Party Social Club. And it's the Labour Party that organise it and everything. I've never known this.
No,
never in my entire years known this.
That part was a bit OTT, because at first you think, it's just a local pub, and then it gets a bit strange from there on. Plus, the family and the landlord just put up with outrageously rude behaviour, considering it's a wake. Yeah. Anybody bringing in politics and that kind of behaviour at a wake, somebody would have stepped in and said, look, go to hell, out, go, that's it. Nobody would tolerate that at all.
No, that's right. I mean, this is meant to be set in the north of England. Someone would have snotted the pair of them.
Yeah, especially you're talking about a very tragic end. When it's something like that always hurts the worst. When it's a kid, and it's a kind of simple kid as well, it really tugs on the heartstrings. And then you have somebody basically crapping all over it in front of the grieving mother. As you say, somebody would have lost their temper and, as you say, probably punched the pair of them.
Yeah. Exactly. So, and I don't think that most people would, in any case, have brought political grievances out like that. That to me seems an extremely artificial scene. And again, it's because Bleasdale wants to politicize everything.
Yeah, even the most crass politician, the most amateurish one, I think would, especially at that time in that location, not a chance would say that. I don't think a real Michael Murray would even try in that spot to do that. He'd have smoothed and cried some crocodile tears to get brownie points, and then he would have went, and that's what would have happened.
That's right, because of course he wants to be popular. You see this throughout the series, that he wants to be popular, but yet why would he do that if he wants to be popular, especially with these people who are quite influential, it seems.
And of course that sets up that farmer and the family even more against Michael Murray, I'd imagine, because they see him coming in acting like an absolute twat.
Yeah, well, this, of course...
especially with his jeering gang next to him, completely unnecessary. I mean, I don't know why he had to bring a gang in at a wake for a small boy.
Yeah. But this, of course, gives Bleasdale the excuse for the farmers to be on his side, to be on Jim Nelson's side.
Another unfortunate bit of bad writing. We seem to be covering these bad writing moments as we go.
Yeah, I mean, it is a well-written series overall, but there are quite big flaws of narrative when you break it down.
Mm.
If you watch it just sort of superficially and just let it pass over you, it's really well written. But actually, if you start to analyze it in depth and break it down and deconstruct it and take it apart, it does fall down under close scrutiny, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Not like that sort of thing a leftist would write.
Part of it... Maybe part of it is because Bleasdale is detached from that kind of people. He's writing about a kind of people that he doesn't associate with, so it's hard for him to get it right.
Yeah, well, I think that this is the main problem, in that Bleasdale very much has a middle-class sensibility, even though I don't think he came from the middle classes originally. I think he came from the working classes, if I remember rightly. But he's certainly someone who went up and completely forgot and detached himself from the working classes. This often happens, especially on the left, Although it does happen on the right, of course, as well. Norman Tebbit.
Oh.
Norman Tebbit is a very famous example of someone who was born working class, went into the Conservative Party, and then completely hated his own class. He completely hated the working classes, and because he didn't want to be seen to come from there, because the Conservative Party wasn't seen as that kind of party. But that's a bit silly in my view. But equally, what you can see is that the Labour Party here is also drifting away from the working classes. And this is really the starting of the Blair generation.
Yeah.
You can see very much Robert Lyndsey's character, Michael Murray, as a proto-Blair, even before Blair arrives on the scene. Don't know what you guys think about that.
Especially the way he's a kind of chameleon as well, which was Blair was infamous for. He could argue anything.
And the way he sucks up to the ethnic minorities as well. That's very much, of course, part of New Labour. We got the working classes anyway. We don't need to appeal to them. We go over to the ethnic minorities because we haven't got them yet. They're untapped potential. And you have that a lot in this particular series. And we've got the foundations for this in this episode and the next as well, but we'll come on to that. Coming back to the sort of timeline, if you like, of the series, you've got this meeting next up in which Murray finds out that he can't build the houses that he promised because of Tory cutbacks. That's an interesting meeting, actually, because it very much sets up some of the events of the later parts of the series. But it's also because 31,000 people weren't registered for the poll tax. I know that you, James, particularly noted that.
Yeah. The whole poll tax riot and protests, that's left quite a mark in British history currently. A lot of people around still remember that. People went to prison, of course, for it. There was, down south, there was moments of violence. People willing to argue it through court, a lot of time and expense. The kind of new generation have sort of forgotten about it, really, because it's not something they experienced firsthand, and their parents were probably quite young at the time now, so it's probably something that's starting to fade.
Yeah, I mean, this series comes off the back of the 1980s. It was released in the middle of 1991, but it's really looking back at what happened in the 1980s. And we still have, of course, John Major, who took over from Margaret Thatcher when she resigned in 1990. So that is in very recent history. And of course, the poll tax came in, if I remember rightly, in 1990, which is just the year before this, and it was extremely unpopular. And in fact, the Conservative Party were very unpopular in the north of England particularly, but also elsewhere, but really managed to rule because the left was so retarded. Because Neil Kinnock was unelectable. Neil Kinnock now, of course, is Baron Kinnock. And he's on several £1 million a year from the European Union.
Nice work if you can get it.
Absolutely. It's amazing, actually, how many peerages have been given out to these so-called leftists who were all dead against the royal family and against monarchy and against aristocracy. And yet they all accepted peerages very willingly.
And they all became millionaires and live ostentatiously comfortable lives. After a lifetime of waffling about class struggle and solidarity, they say, "Oh, I've got my helicopter now, bye."
That's right. On the other side of things, you've got strange people in the Labour Party, like, well, or the Liberal Party, on the left anyway, like Tony Benn. Tony Benn, of course, he was actually born into the aristocracy, although it was quite recent aristocracy. I think that it was either his father or grandfather who'd been granted the peerage, but was hereditary. And he actually gave up his peerage. And you've got that Tony Benn characterization in this character of Mervyn Sloan. I don't know if you got that, but he's very much modelled on Tony Benn.
Was he sure
That's the old guy with the glasses.
Yeah, you think?
Who's always with Lou Barnes and Peter.
You think that would be Tony Benn? Because he seemed... his character wasn't quite as how the left would portray him, because they tend to fawn over him. Remember there was the incautious remark about how he wouldn't want to be black?
Yes, but he says that he wouldn't want to be black because of the racism, if you remember.
Yeah.
So he is very much of that type, and always talking about this revolution next Wednesday, and having book signings and so on. He's very much of that type, and of course completely blind to these other two, who he's always hanging about with this Lou Barnes and this Peter.
So you think he was more the innocent in the game being used?
Yeah, and Tony Benn always struck me as that type. He struck me as an idealist who didn't really know what he was talking about. He had these ideas that were based on theory, but he didn't know the common man at all, even though he marched with the common man. He had these ideas about the common man, but actually, if he'd actually met the common man and sat down with him and had a beer with him in a pub and so on, probably the ideas of the common man would have appalled him.
Probably.
Because
much like you hear these Labour and other left politicians talk about how they very much don't want direct democracy or a lot of referendums, because they know if they did, they'd have things like hanging brought back and a whole bunch of other things that they claim that people don't want, but they know that the common man would have it back in a heartbeat.
Yeah, that's right, because it's always been a strange thing in the north of England where this is said, that the average working man has what would be considered extreme right-wing ideas and ideals. And the top tier of the Labour Party either had no idea or chose to ignore it for power, or they were so into their theory that they didn't really care. They just saw the common man as an abstraction.
I think that it gets to the point where they're so deep into the theory, and the theory built upon theory, and so on, that they've got to the point where they think they don't even need to consult reality or people, because they say, well, we've got this book. Why would I need to actually talk to anybody when I've got this book?
That's right. Apparently Marx was the same, Karl Marx, that when he went into the beer halls and tried to lecture the so-called proletariat, and they sort of booed him off and everything, and and he kind of went away, thinking, well, I'm Professor Marx, I'm giving them their theory.
How very dare you?
That's right. But that's quite typical, and certainly typical of people like Tony Benn, who he would have marched, and he did march, did go on marches and so on, with striking workers and everything, but he, of course, went with the union leaders. He didn't go with the rank and file, with the people who would have said, we don't want immigrants here because they're taking our jobs. But it's quite incredible. I know people who were in unions and so on, and people who were in unions, they often got offered trips down to London and things like that when there were CND marches, and they would talk to the miners and say, do you fancy a trip down London? Free beer on the bus down and so on. You just got to do a march. And so they would be bussed down. And that's often been forgotten. A lot of these marches, the numbers were swelled by common working folk who didn't have any sympathies with the causes that they were being bussed down for whatsoever, but they gave them, a few free beers and a day out.
Still goes on today. You still hear about various scandals with protests happening. There's tons of buses around about various countries.
That's right. It happened, of course, quite recently with the American elections between the Democrats and the Republicans, when Democrats were, and students and everything, were bussed in from all parts of the country to attack and protest against Trump's stadium bits of oratory, the campaign trail and everything.
It's even more absurd with the size of America. You could have people bussed in hundreds of miles.
That's right. Now, don't get me wrong, I don't particularly like Trump either, but these are facts. And certainly there was a lot of that during the 1970s, 80s, and so on, with the left, when people would get busted. And also the other way around, when in the miners' strike, very famous miners' strike of 1984 and so on, students would be bussed in as well. Although the miners detested the students and they didn't want them there because, of course, they didn't see them as having anything to do with them.
Well,
No, that's right. And this has always been the odd thing about the left, in that you have very middle-class leftists who have completely different ideas from the working-class members of unions and so on, who are not really of the left, but nonetheless support the unions and the Labour Party. And it's been an odd relationship between the classes.
And it's quite a shock to anybody that sort of meets these sort of middle-class socialists, that the champagne socialist types that do LARP around pretending to be of this type. It's quite a shock when you encounter them how... vile a lot of them are, quite frankly, but also how corrupt they are in just their daily life and how false they are.
Yeah.
You can see why they'd be absolutely repellent to any of these genuine working class men or women that had worked their way up and maybe held, mistakenly or not, to certain beliefs. And then they encounter these people who are actually above them in the hierarchy and must see them as repellent, completely hollow people, empty, full of words and nothing else.
Yeah, that's right. You see, your average working man, all this theory and so on by Marx and by the Frankfurt School and by Noam Chomsky and by all these big leftist intellectuals, means absolutely nothing to them. Karl Marx to them is probably a member of the Marx Brothers. And they would have never read a book by Trotsky or whatever. They'd probably not even know Trotsky was.
Yeah. And even in the context of this, what would any of that mean to the guys that are running through the sheep field with a hammer, trying to steal sheep and kick a farmer's head off? What does any of that theory mean to those guys who were all even, they're pretending to be on the same side? That's
right. Well, it's an interesting thing, actually, because it's a reaction that they actually would have had. Because it was given to them. And this is the thing, that the morality, the overarching morality, is given to them. And it's like during the miners' strike, when strike breakers would be called scab, because Jim Nelson in this miniseries is often called a scab. That was a particular term for a strike breaker during the 1980s and so on. It would be called a scab, and it would be daubed on his car and on his house and so on. That really did happen. But no one would question the morality of that simply because he was a strike breaker. And it wouldn't matter why he broke the strike. It would just be seen as a strike breaker, and that's it. That's as deep as the morality went. So it is quite accurate, is that?
But it shows you two things. One, that the theory upon theory means nothing to them, really. What actually means something to them is that somebody in a position above them hands them how to behave and think, which ironically is the kind of thing that somebody in the right would see the world. It's the duty of the people above to set a good morality and world for the people below to live in.
Well, yeah, the only difference is that the right is more honest about it than the left.
Mm. And at least if you've got an honest start to it, you're not going to end up tied up in ludicrous knots and leading everybody off a cliff.
That's right, and this is the great problem of the left. The left is terribly dishonest, whereas the right has always said what it believes in. We're not talking about the liberal right here, this fake right of the liberals like the Conservative Party, who, as I say, they're just rejuvenated and reformed 19th century Whigs. That's all they are.
Or just the left of yesterday or a few years ago.
Exactly. Especially now with the present day Conservative Party that are even further to the left than the Thatcherite government of the 1980s, because the Thatcherite government was basically based on Hayekian economics, and Hayek was a classical liberal. So you can see how far left things have gone. And the proper right, the right that goes way back philosophically to, I mean, even Coleridge had certain sympathies for Jewish causes and stuff like that, but in general, he was a rightist writer. We're talking Coleridge the poet here, because he was also very much a Tory supporter and wrote political theory. If you go back to that, it was very much honest, and it was the idea that things come top down. Whereas the left have always said, no, things come bottom up, and it's a revolution of the people and so on, when in fact they're lying completely about it. So anyway, so we've got Mervyn Sloan. He's of that type. He's of the Tony Benn type. Then we've got this Lou Barnes and Peter, and of course we start to realize that Lou Barnes and Peter may not be the people who we think.
Yeah.
You
go a bit deeper than that.
Yeah, you can see Peter's a very shady, strange character at this point.
That's right, yeah. And I think it's in the third episode, which we'll get on to later, where they sort of come out and you realize that they're not who they're meant to be. And Peter suddenly changes his accent, and it goes from very much a Scouse accent, a Liverpudlian accent, to an upper-class received pronunciation one.
And even mocks by using certain turns of phrases. He kind of mocks the locals.
That's right, yeah. Yeah, very much so. They're obviously Conservatives. They're obviously Tories who have infiltrated the Labour Party to create havoc. Of course, at the end of episode 2, you get Lou, Peter, and Mervyn. So Mervyn, again, this Tony Benn type character, but he's not in on it at all. Of course, he genuinely wants this revolution, and he's been conned because he's a bit simple by Lou and Peter. And we have this plan to use the ethnic minorities to bring this unnamed city to its knees by agitating them. This is, of course, to bring the Conservative government down. Michael Murray, of course, is reluctant because he always sides with the ethnic minorities, but then Lou mentions this Eileen Critchley girl and holds it over him to blackmail him, doesn't he?
That's right. He was told that just the mention of her would stop him dead in the tracks. And any more than that, it's all need to know.
So. And it's sinister how they must have known that, how much access. It kind of gives a nod that these guys have access to things that you would never think possible. And how did they get all that information on her? How did they know who she was? So they must have some in-depth files.
Very much. Absolutely right. So, in fact, you see I think it's in the third episode, you see these shady Conservative people looking at his past school records and seeing what they've got on him.
The slideshow with him taking bribes and so on, and cheating on his wife.
Yeah. That's right. So they're constantly spying on him to try to bring him down. But this, I think that this is quite realistic, but it's important to remember that it went on both sides.
And still does.
Yeah, very much so. In fact, it's interesting about going back to the miners' strikes. It was a big thing. when I was growing up. The miners, the trade union leaders of the miners, they all had their telephones tapped and bugged and everything. And you had MI5 infiltrators in the union itself. And we know this because because Dame Stella Rimington, who was the head of MI5 later on, wrote about it in her memoirs, completely breaking the Official Secrets Act. But anyway,
not a secret anymore.
No, never trust a woman with gossip.
It's worth, of course, remembering. That the shenanigans you see going on in this series and what you're mentioning there with the miners' strike and the infiltration, these things will still be going on today. So if anybody's walking about thinking, "Oh, it's all clear, there's no problem at all," they're living with their head in the clouds. Of course, they're still doing the same, and probably far more right now.
Yes, well, we'll get on to that in more depth in the next Mjolnir the Movies episode, so tune in for that. But yes, you also get in this particular episode and in the next one, so episodes 2 and 3, this dubious relationship with Jim's best friend, this Martin, this poet and teacher, who's having an affair with one of his students.
Oh yeah,
He's a little bit brown.
Yeah, that's right. This half caste, as it used to be termed. I don't know if that's politically correct anymore, but there we are. Yes, that's right. It's very dubious, isn't it? It's very borderline. She's a sixth former.
Yeah.
Oh.
And yet this guy is meant to be very moral. He's meant to be one of the good guys. It's interesting how we slipped that in, I think.
And Jim just seems to be totally okay with it, and he makes kind of wee jokes about how good his wife is and so on, and just then kind of shrugs it off.
Yeah.
There's no real moral outrage or rebuke, or him saying, I'm friends with your wife, or wives are friends, maybe behave yourself, you dirty bastard.
And there's no idea of that it's unethical to be having sex with one of your students who's barely legal. And so that's very much a leftist morality that's been brought in there.
Especially
so they've slipped that in.
Especially as the way that it's portrayed. It's obviously he's just using her for sex.
Yeah.
They're not shy about it at all. He's getting rid of her at the end.
Well, it's a two-way thing, isn't it? Because she's getting rid of him at the same time as he's getting rid of her, isn't he? She tells him that he should go back to his wife. In fact, if you look at it, she's always seen as the wiser, even though she's 17, and he's middle-aged, and yet she's portrayed as being wiser. So we have a nod towards feminism and a nod towards ethnic minorities again as being wiser than white males.
That's Bleasdale again, though, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly. Because there's always the leftist morality at the back of all this. Now, coming on to the end of the second episode and the transition into the third, there's the visit to the mothers, which we discussed before to ask about his father, talking about Michael Murray here. So we've discussed that. But then right at the end, we get this character who's introduced, this Barbara Douglas, who's not really called Barbara Douglas at all. We find out later, so tune in for that. But it's quite obvious that Michael Murray fancies her. But it's interesting why he fancies her.
Because he likes to drink Kenko coffee. There's who's going to get that reference?
Yes, in fact, Lyndsey Duncan, who played Barbara Douglas, she was once the woman who did the Kenko coffee advert. So there we go.
She was quite a heartthrob for it as well.
I think she's gorgeous.
I don't want to know what I think of her, folks.
Yeah. And I know you two are not convinced by this, but, I think she's quite lovely.
Many a man's posh bit dream.
But yeah, but actually, that's why Michael Murray falls for her, because apparently she smells of money. uh,
And coffee.
And coffee. Yeah. So there's again this fatal character flaw of Michael Murray, in that he's always had that. He's always been attracted to position and wealth and people above his class.
Yeah.
And of course, he's a married man with 3 kids, I think, at this point. So it's worth remembering that when he's leching over her.
Yeah, very much so. In fact, in the 3rd episode, we get a very brief glimpse of his wife and kids. Now, you see the faces of the kids, the 3 daughters, but you never see the face of his wife. Did you notice that?
Yeah,
I mentioned this in the
bit of a Charlie Brown moment.
Yeah.
You only ever see the parents from the shoulders down.
That's right, yeah. And that, I think, is absolutely deliberate. This idea that she's almost dehumanized by him. He's terrified of her as well. He never wants to speak to her. He never wants to be with her or anything like that. He's terrified whenever she calls.
She must be horrific.
Well,
she didn't seem that bad on the call.
Yeah, that's right. It's a very odd thing. But I think that this goes back to Michael Murray's personality, in that he's always attracted to people who are strangers and aloof and distant. And he's never attracted to people who are close to him.
Yeah.
And this also goes for the ethnic minorities.
Yeah.
He seems to just attach himself to anybody or anything, for that matter, that will get him a rise, or that he can ride the coattails off.
Yeah, I think that there are 2 things going on. I think that one thing is with the abuse of trust that he had in his childhood, where he told the truth. He told the truth to people around him who were close to him. And he didn't get believed. And that meant that there was a certain distance formed between the people who should have been the ones who he trusted most, who were closest to him. And he formed attachments to people who he didn't know instead, who were very much distant to him. Although, at the same time, this Eileen Critchley was obviously very distant, both in terms of class and in the fact that she abused him, but yet he was incredibly attracted to her. But again, that goes back to this fatal flaw that he has, this attraction to wealth and position right from being very young.
But the problem with that is then Bleasdale's walking into the wrong area for him, for he's got the boy being born with this attraction for certain things. Oops!
Exactly, yeah. Exactly.
Because he never wrote a backstory for that part.
And this is the problem with the left. You can never get away from rightist ideas, because they always come back. You can't get away from it because it's nature.
He's got an excuse for Michael Murray in the stories present, but there's no reason for it. Each step he tries to go back and explain it, he's going to end up trying to claim that the surgeon at the birth looked left instead of right, and that changed the guy's life. It starts getting absurd trying to find an excuse.
Yeah, very much so, yeah. Whereas we on the right would just say, inherent, preferences and so on.
And interesting enough, so would the biologist.
Yep, exactly. Because rightist ideas are based on nature and science. There you go. You can't get away from it. What is interesting, I think, with the introduction of Barbara is that you very much get class sensibilities foregrounded. I don't know if you picked up on that.
Yeah,
especially in the cafe scene.
Yeah,
I think we said in the last episode that she's looking at this greasy egg, and she won't put it into her own mouth, and she doesn't understand how anybody else could eat that slop. I think she calls it the slop, and Michael says maybe they eat it because they like it. So she is completely detached from that class of people. She doesn't understand it. People like me like bacon, eggs, and black pudding and beans and stuff like that in the morning. We love it. we know it's bad for us, but we like it anyway. But she seems to think that people shouldn't be eating this.
Yeah, that's right. She's very genteel in that kind of way. It actually starts even before that, because the first thing that you see is Michael Murray on the run with his cronies.
And he's not very healthy.
That's right. Yeah. So he's working off the sweat so that he can put the calories back on in the cafe. But she stays in the mayoral car, and she's listening to classical music while Murray's leading this military-style chant full of expletives.
Yeah.
Fuck this, fuck that, fuck the other, and everything. And so you've got the two things going on at the same time, the classical music and this chant. So the two sort of clash, if you like, this little class war going on there in the soundtrack. But then if you notice that it finishes with this amusing little scene between the brother when he's exhausted and he collapses on the car. And it starts going, oh, fucking hell, everything, swaying in front of Barbara. And then Murray says, don't sway in front of the lady, even though he's just spent the entire run swearing his head off. So it's pretty funny, is that bit. But, props to Bleasdale for that.
I kind of like the way how they made it so that Michael, when he's out doing his jogging runs, they don't really make out that he isn't fit. They make out that he is quite strong, like fit and healthy, and he does this run while doing this swear-ridden chant. Anybody try doing that? I liked how they didn't have a cheap trick in there where they made it where he was the one collapsing. He's like a liar about his fitness and his entourage and this whole get-up that he's doing in the park as a public display. He is genuinely quite physically healthy.
That's right.
So he's not like a complete pushover. He's not like completely weak and awful and evil and heinous. He does have some convictions, at least, because he's able to go out there and get to that level of physical fitness. And I like how they've done that. They didn't do any cheap tricks there.
Although that's because Michael's problems is his moral problems. Despite his fitness and he ends up an absolute coward. He cowers before Jim. When Jim stands up for himself at last physically, and he also cowers before his brother when his brother stands up for himself finally. So
and there's a few scenes as well where people make reference that he's going bald, and he suddenly turns into a little child. He says, "No, I'm not," and he's like gets all paranoid and he's checking his hair, and I'm not, and it's a really interesting character development that. But then he gets punched out as well. He gets his nose broken.
You're sort of seeing going from him at the top of his game in the sort of first episode into the second, and now you're seeing character flaw after character flaw coming up to haunt him. Yeah.
And it's slowly falling apart through episode 3. It starts off where he's this peak of physical condition. He's brave. He's going on this rant. He's trying to rise up popular opinion of him, but slowly through the episodes, he starts deteriorating until he gets his nose broken.
Well, this is what you get throughout the series, I think, is the erosion of his power.
Mm-hmm.
It's not really his power, it's a facade of power.
Yeah.
Because all the way through he's sort of compensating for the fact that deep down he's quite weak.
Yeah.
And in fact, if you remember, at the end of the series, spoiling it for everyone here, but at the end of the series, Barbara says that I like weak men.
Oh. And remember in that episode 3 as well, he also gets a verbal beatdown by his brother. So his brother at the start of the episode is collapsing and gasping for air, but by the end of it, the brother, he punches him. He argues with him in the back of the car, and he takes off his chauffeur jacket and he just walks away. So his brother has gone from being the weak one to the strong one. So it's like a role reversal in the end of the episode.
And you see Michael cowering with his eyes wide open. He's actually see him hunched in. Yeah, he's all hunched in, and his brother's pointing at him, telling him everything he thinks of him. And the brother just takes the car and leaves him by the side of the road.
Then he runs
right.
back to the car and opens the door, remember? And
That's
he's
right.
like
Throws
covering.
his junk out.
That's right. He throws Michael out as well, doesn't he? He throws
Yeah.
Michael out, and Michael begs you, "Don't hit me."
And he takes his money as well. He takes his holiday money off him by taking it right out of his wallet.
Yeah.
That's right. And then to add the embarrassment, of course, that coach pulls up with it, and the driver gets out and mistakes him for this celebrity soap star, doesn't he?
All the Japanese tourists were taking photos of him non-stop.
That's right. It's quite a funny little episode, is that? And one thing I do like about Bleasdale is that he goes into these comic asides, these bits of absurdities, and he has these bits of bathos where you go from really serious bits to completely ridiculous parts, and I think that's quite good. It's actually quite like real life in a way, and very much in Korean cinema they use it quite a lot as well. I remember there was this film called The Host, and it's a sort of a creature feature, a bit of a horror and everything, but there's some absurd comic moments in it as well. and I think that's more realistic. That's more like real life, and Bleasdale doesn't shirk from that. He sort of does have a grounding in real life. It's just that everything comes from politics, and that's his problem. Equally, though, just as Michael Murray is deteriorating and his facade of power is deteriorating, because, of course, the difference between Michael Murray and his brother is that Frank, his brother, is really strong. He's always been strong. He was strong as a child. And it's only the social situation and the manipulation of social position that's made him weak. And so as soon as that is broken away, he can be strong again. And that's quite interesting about the left, I think, as a general rule, in that they try to structure society in such a way that the weak become strong. And they've always done that.
And there's also a little scene, well, not a scene, like a cut, where the brother, he takes his wallet and he takes out a few notes, and there's a big pile of cash in there in his hand. And he takes a few notes because you can tell it's still his brother he's stealing the money from, and he has a bit of a heart, and he's going to give the rest of it back. But he decides at the last second, now I'm just going to take it all, and he throws the empty wallet at Michael, and Michael rises up to say something, and he sits straight back down again when the brother turns around. It's a brilliant little piece of writing that and the character development.
I think he obviously decided he'd earned that money by this point with the abuse.
I'm taking it, yeah.
Although Michael obviously had a bit of money hidden away still, because remember he basically bribed the bus driver, the coach driver, with some.
That's right.
So Michael must have it squirreled away in money folds here and there.
Yeah.
Quite a sum too, when you look at the notes he's pulling out.
I know, who carries that kind of money around with them?
Well, don't forget that this is 1991 and credit cards were not as well used as they are now.
I keep wondering that, because people have to appreciate when they watch this, if that same thing was to happen to his character now in 2019, it'd be no problem. He'd get on his mobile phone, call a taxi up, and pay with a contactless debit card. But back then, I mean, I was only, 8, 6, 7, 8 at that time. You had to carry money around with you. There wasn't like ATMs everywhere. You can just walk into a store and get cash back. They weren't as widespread as they are now. So it must have been a lot tougher then. So you can watch the situation and think, God, maybe he's only 5 miles away from home, but that's like a massive distance back then if you didn't have any money.
It's worth pointing out, though, that the amount of money he was carrying was obscene, even for the time. That was some pile of money.
Yeah.
I didn't count it, but he must have had like, £1,000 on him at least.
Easy. Yeah.
And you think, well, what's he spreading that on? He's not spreading that in a bar or a fry-up.
No.
I think that that's also to show off. I think that that's part of his character, actually. Because he likes to surround himself with wealth all the time.
And he does take his bribes in suitcases of cash, so he's probably going to spend it.
That's right, yeah. But yeah, I mean, going on to the other little thread in this, where he has that lackey of his tried to find Eileen Critchley and his mother when his brother takes his mother on holiday, because in this scene, of course, he says that he's going on holiday, and Frankie takes the mother on holiday with his family. And he gets this lackey of his, Michael gets this lackey of his to try to track all these, both his mother and this Eileen Critchley down. Because, of course, we get that scene where this Eileen Critchley, this girl from his past, suddenly writes him a note and leaves it at his mother's house. But, of course, it's Barbara Douglas who leaves it there. Barbara Douglas is not who she appears to be. As I say, when he gets that lackey to find them, he has to do all this manually. There's no internet. So people have to realize this, that back in 1991, it's a completely different world.
Yeah.
People are waiting at the side of the phone because there are not very many mobile phones around in 1991. It's the pre-mobile phone age.
Most records still weren't computerized.
That's right, yeah. Everything was done on paper. It was held at the local library. So if you wanted to research something, you had to do a lot of legwork.
Yeah, I remember that. I remember even back then, even having to go to the library. Who goes to the library now? You just get an electronic download for your phone or whatever. Nothing like that existed back then. Facebook didn't exist. You couldn't just go on Facebook and type in Eileen Critchley and find her. You'd almost be like a non-existent person to society. Nobody would know who you are.
Yeah, that's right. Going back to this slow decline of Michael Murray's, you also get a slow decline of Jim Nelson throughout the series. And they sort of parallel each other. Did you notice that? So yeah. Jim Nelson slowly starts waking up nude in various different places. He goes to see a psychiatrist who suspiciously is called Mrs. Goldup, and seems to be a Jewish stereotype, doesn't she?
There was hints of her talking about how she had seen the worst in mankind and all that. There was a very sort of semi-subtle, not very subtle hint.
Are we talking implicit shower here?
Well, there were certain hints said in the film that could be interpreted as certain things. I'll say that. If you listen to her dialogue, it's quite interesting.
Yeah, and she's very much portrayed as this wise Jewess, isn't she?
A rich old lady as a psychologist talking about the bad times.
And Bleasdale, of course, married to Julia Moses. Cough.
Moses.
Cough. Yeah, so there's that. What I found interesting as well is, of course, he gets sent to this psychiatrist, does Jim Nelson, by his doctor. I found that a very funny character, the doctor of his.
The doctor who's Scottish when he's angry.
That's right, yeah. It's a Glaswegian one. And his accent comes out when he's angry.
Well acted, though, the way it slipped in and out. Can't be an easy thing to do as an actor, to change accents mid-conversation, back and forth.
That's right, yeah. Very good piece of acting, that's right. And the Doctor is interesting because he's such a tragicomic figure. Because, of course, he realized he self-diagnoses as having cancer in the end, but he reveals it to Jim Nelson, who was a total hypochondriac, in such an amusing way.
Yeah, you didn't know what was going on there at first, did you? When you first see that?
That's right, because he's very drunk and he strips off in front of Jim Nelson, who wonders what the hell's going on. And, I'm not that type,
says, "Give me your hand," and he sort of puts it on his tummy. You're like, "What on earth is going on here?"
That's right. And then there's, what do you feel? A lump? Yes. And and then he tells him that he's got cancer, almost definitely got cancer, of course, and that the problem is with him and not with Jim Nelson. And I think that is done to take Jim Nelson down a peg or two to make him less perfect, actually, as a characterization.
Mm-hmm.
It was foreshadowed by his previous appointment. Remember, the Doctor's quite distracted, drawing with a fountain pen, talking about how the creaking door and how Jim Nelson somehow keeps surviving all these supposed illnesses while other good people are dying, and you can tell he's lost in thought.
Yeah.
And it's obvious. By that point, of course, you realise looking back, he was talking about himself. By this point, the Doctor must have known he was dying, and then later on, the Doctor tells Jim to come in for this appointment, which is unusual because normally the Doctor wants nothing to do with him.
And even though he's got cancer and he knows that he's probably going to die soon, he still passes on, even though he's probably angry, scared, terrified that he's going to die. He still passes on this I don't know, code or moral that he should enjoy his life because he hasn't got cancer. And stop worrying and just enjoy your life. And if it happens, it happens. But he is the one that's dying, and even though he retains his professionalism as a doctor.
Yeah, that's right. Now, the ending of this particular episode comes with Barbara and this one of the journalists who we've seen earlier, Bubbles, this rightist journalist, stalking Mr. Weller. So that sets things up nicely for the next episode. And obviously, again, it's begun, this episode, it's begun with Barbara in a car, namely the mayoral car. And it's ended with Barbara in a car. Did you notice that? So it's come full circle.
The journalist with the funny moustache. Or is that the same episode?
Bubbles with a moustache he has on later on. Yeah, he doesn't have that at first. He gets that later.
Yeah, that's right. He hasn't got it yet. He's got a rip in his cheek from where Mr. Weller thrust an umbrella out of his letterbox to ward him away.
It looked really painful, that, didn't it?
Yeah.
You really felt that looking
realistic.
at it.
Yeah.
That's right. It looked very realistic.
The character that Bubbles was talking to on the train, remember? At the train, I should say.
Yeah.
You, Dave, should notice this discussion he has about how his mother was angry because his father rushed him up to get born in Yorkshire so he could play for the cricket team in future. I thought, how apt and appropriate considering your own timely videos.
That's right. Yes, on my channel you'll see a video taken from Scarborough Cricket Club about the policy that Yorkshire County Cricket Club had from 1968 to 1992. So they ended that policy just a year after this was put out. And that was that only people born in Yorkshire or of staunch Yorkshire descent, traditional Yorkshire families, were allowed to play for Yorkshire County Cricket Club. And that was to keep foreigners out, basically, because in 1968, the cricket board decided that foreigners would be allowed to play in the county championships. So this again is a little nod towards alleged racism and so on. It's again making the right, because these are rightist characters, of course, that we're talking about here. These dodgy meetings between this unknown person at the moment and this journalist Bubbles, and then there's the scene on the train with Lou, isn't it? And they avoid each other, and I don't know what's going on, but all these characters are very rightist, and so it's associating these rightist characters with implicit racism is this idea. So that's the idea behind that anyway. So is there any more to discuss about this? Would anyone like to add anything before we pack up for this particular episode?
I think we've talked about a lot of stuff here in this episode.
We have indeed.
There's a lot to think about in these episodes in general.
Yes.
And I'm sure
Very much so.
we'll all think of something right after we end this anyway. That's how it always works.
Oh, bugger.
But there's always next episode, so tune in, folks.
Very true.
And subscribe. And perhaps even leave a like. Don't leave a dislike unless you're going to say why you dislike it in the comment section. Because we hate these fuckers who leave dislikes and don't say why they dislike it, don't we?
At least tell us why you dislike it.
Oh,
Yes.
there is some pleasure if we get a big load of them, because then we know we've really annoyed somebody that probably deserved it. But I'm a twisty bugger like that.
Yeah. Even if you want to make fun of my accent, I mean, just go ahead. Just tell us below.
And movie suggestions and comments, don't go wrong.
That's right. If you have any requests for future episodes, obviously the next 2 episodes will be dedicated to GBH, but after that, we're all ears. So
we'll be resuming our normal broadcasts.
Absolutely. So I'll say goodbye from me.
Goodbye from me.
Goodbye from me.
Until next time. See you, folks.
Bye-bye.